President Kennedy is dead. He died in a hospital after being cut down by an assassin's bullet. While his
This is the BBC Home Service. It is with deep regret that we announce that President Kennedy is dead. He was shot down as he was driving in an open car through the city of Dallas.
The date, November the 22nd, 1963. And as the world's airwaves buzzed with the news of the assassination of American President John F. Kennedy, hardly anyone was aware of the quieter death of a retired university don in his home in Oxford. Clive Staples Lewis would have been grateful for this lack of publicity, and if that seems paradoxical for a well-known writer and broadcaster, it was characteristic of his life, a life full of paradoxes. For example, he had no children of his own, and yet he wrote some of the most popular children's stories ever written. Stories like The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, The Magician's Nephew, and The Last Battle. For the first half of his life, he was an atheist, and yet went on to write some of the most brilliant and enduring Christian literature of this century, with books like Mere Christianity and The Screwtape Letters. His career was as a tutor and then professor of literature in the universities of Oxford and Cambridge, while his popular writing, for which he was to become best known, was a mere sideline. Away from the lecture theatre, Lewis was quite at home by the fireside of a pub, enjoying a pipe and a pint with his many friends, discussing ideas for novels and poems and imaginary lands. And it was from the meeting of this circle of friends, called the Inklings, that he and J.R.R. Tolkien went on to invent and develop their fantastic tales of the enchanted lands of Narnia and Middle-earth. I was just 7 years old when Lewis died and hadn't even heard of him then, but in just a couple of years I was to be enchanted by the Narnia books, with a spell so powerful that I'm still captivated by their magic. Like most people, the first book I read was The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, a tale of how some children from this world enter the land of Narnia through a magic wardrobe in the house of an old professor. In the land of Narnia they meet talking animals, a wicked witch, and the magnificent lion Aslan. What separates Lewis's Narnia books from other children's stories is that while you're reading them, you're not conscious of actually reading, but of being read to. The style is easy and picturesque, the tales are simple, unashamedly anthropomorphic, and the descriptive passages conjure up breathtakingly real images. Here's a passage from The Magician's Nephew, where two children from our world, Diggory and Polly, find themselves whisked by magic from one world to another, and eventually find themselves in an unborn world of darkness.
In the darkness, something was happening at last. A voice had begun to sing. It was very far away, and Diggory found it hard to decide from what direction it was coming. Sometimes it seemed to come from all directions at once. Sometimes he almost thought it was coming out of the earth beneath them. Its lower notes were deep enough to be the voice of the earth herself. There were no words. There was hardly even a tune. But it was, beyond comparison, the most beautiful noise he had ever heard. It was so beautiful he could hardly bear it. Then two wonders happened at the same moment. One was that the voice was suddenly joined by other voices, more voices than you could possibly count. They were in harmony with it, but far higher up the scale, cold, tingling, silvery voices. The second wonder was that the blackness overhead all at once was blazing with stars. They didn't come out gently, one by one, as they do on a summer evening. One moment there had been nothing but darkness. Next moment 1,000,000 points of light leaped out. Single stars, constellations, and planets brighter and bigger than any in our world. There were no clouds. The new stars and the new voices began at exactly the same time. If you had seen and heard it as Diggory did, you would have felt quite certain that it was the stars themselves which were singing, and that it was the first voice, the deep one, which had made them appear and made them sing. Far away and down near the horizon, the sky began to turn grey. A light wind, very fresh, began to stir. The sky in that one place grew slowly and steadily paler. You could see shapes of hills standing up dark against it. All the time, the voice went on singing. The eastern sky changed from white to pink, and from pink to gold. The voice rose and rose till all the air was shaking with it. And just as it swelled to the mightiest and most glorious sound it had yet produced, the sun arose. You could imagine that it laughed for joy as it came up, and as its beams shot across the lands, the travellers could see for the first time what sort of place they were in. It was a valley, through which a broad, swift river wound its way, flowing eastward towards the sun. Southward there were mountains, northward there were lower hills. But it was a valley of mere earth, rock and water. There was not a tree, not a bush, not a blade of grass to be seen. The earth was of many colours. They were fresh, hot and vivid. They made you feel excited, until you saw the singer himself, and then you forgot everything else. It was a lion, huge, shaggy and bright. It stood facing the risen sun, its mouth wide open in song. The lion was pacing to and fro about that empty land and singing his new song. It was softer and more lilting than the song by which he had called up the stars and the sun, a gentle, rippling music. And as he walked and sang, the valley grew green with grass. It spread out from the lion like a pool. It ran up the sides of the little hills like a wave. In a few minutes it was creeping up the lower slopes of the distant mountains, making that young world every moment softer.
C.S. Lewis was born in Belfast in the winter of 1898. His father, Albert, a solicitor, and his mother, Flora, a clergyman's daughter and mathematics graduate. He had a brother, Warren, who was 3 years older, and the two brothers, with their chosen names of Jack and Warnie, developed a friendship that was to remain strong for the rest of their lives. Their parents were caring and well-educated people, each with a great love of books, and this was to have an early and lasting effect on the young Master Jack. Writing many years later, in his autobiographical work, Surprised by Joy, he recalls this bookish boyhood.
I am a product of long corridors, empty sunlit rooms, upstairs indoor silences, attics explored in solitude, distant noises of gurgling cisterns and pipes, and the noise of wind under the tiles. Also of endless books. My father bought all the books he read and never got rid of any of them. There were books in the study, books in the drawing room, books in the cloakroom, books 2 deep in the great bookcase on the landing, books in a bedroom, books piled as high as my shoulder in the cistern attic, books of all kinds reflecting every transient stage of my parents' interests, books readable and unreadable, books suitable for a child, and books emphatically not. Nothing was forbidden me. In the seemingly endless rainy afternoons I took volume after volume from the shelves. I had always the same certainty of finding a book that was new to me as a man who walks into a field has of finding a new blade of grass.
Lewis started writing stories himself at the age of 6, when he created the imaginary Animal Land, and these early stories clearly show the seeds of imagination which were later to grow and blossom into the Chronicles of Narnia. But the tranquillity and happiness of these early years was shattered at the age of 8 when his mother died. His father became so wrapped up in his own grief that the two boys felt very distant from him. And to make matters worse, Lewis was packed off to his first school, Wynyard School in Watford, a place so terrible that he later referred to it as Belsen. Equally unhappy schooling followed at Campbell College, Belfast, Cherbourg House in Malvern, and Malvern College, until in 1914 he went to Great Bookham in Surrey to have private tuition from W.T. Kirkpatrick. This was a much happier time for him, as he and Kirk were more on the same wavelength, and together enjoyed the Norse myths, the great Greek and Latin sagas, and the English classics. Lewis learnt to be logical and questioning, two important traits which were later to characterize so much of his own writing. The 2 years with Kirkpatrick ended when Lewis won a scholarship to University College, Oxford, a place with which he instantly fell in love. The stay was brief. He was enlisted and went to join the war in France, spending most of the time ill or wounded, until he returned to Oxford in January 1919 to resume his studies. His ambition was to become a fellow of a college, but first he had to spend a year studying Greek and Latin literature before proceeding to the Greats course, where he specialized in philosophy and ancient history. He graduated in 1922 and was later elected a fellow and tutor of Magdalen College, Oxford, in 1925, a position he held for 29 years. It was during this period that his writing began in earnest. Many of his childhood ideas now took shape and were published, and among the first were some very long narrative poems, like Dymer and The Nameless Isle. Lewis settled into university and academic life as a man settles into his favourite armchair. Around him gathered a circle of friends who shared similar interests and had imaginations like his. One of the first of those friends was Owen Barfield, the only surviving member of that group. Lewis described Barfield as not so much his alter ego, so much as his anti-self, a man with the same interests, but who approaches them from different angles. I asked Owen Barfield how his friendship with Lewis started.
On an intellectual basis, to start with, it was always, in a way, predominantly on an intellectual basis, although we became fairly quickly also close personal friends. There was something, some kind of affinity between us. I think became evident fairly soon, partly being argumentative, I think, because, we both liked argument and weren't prepared to drop a subject if we got it. Most people are. If it gets too contentious or anything, they want to let it go because they feel you're quarrelling. But that wasn't the case with him, or with me. We all wanted to carry on hitting hard at each other. Well, we argued about mainly the nature of knowledge, or nature of thought, if you like, and particularly the significance, value of imagination. And the primary difference between us was that I was beginning to hold, but at that time I was only beginning to form one's ideas, really. But I held pretty firmly that imagination was one way of finding out the truth, parallel with such ways as ordinary scientific hypothesis. He wouldn't have that. He held imagination very important, and he had, as you know, a fine imagination himself. But perhaps for that very reason, he valued imagination. He was really in love with it. So he didn't want it to have anything to do with truth.
One major difference between Owen Barfield and C.S. Lewis was that Barfield, with no religious upbringing, had become a Christian before he went to Oxford. Lewis, on the other hand, with a Christian family background, had given up his beliefs. Others of his new friends were also Christians, notably Hugo Dyson and J.R.R. Tolkien. One of his old childhood friends, Arthur Greaves, had also become a Christian, and Lewis found the whole business rather worrying. Ever since his early childhood, Lewis had been trying to recapture the sense of joy that had left him when his mother died. Joy, for Lewis, was not some passing feeling of happiness or well-being, but something altogether deeper and lasting. He well knew that some forms of pleasure could give joy. Reading was one of them. But these were mere tastes or samples of the real thing. The quest of his life was to find this absolute joy. He never supposed that he was looking for God. Indeed, he earnestly strove to keep God out of his life. But it was while reading G.K. Chesterton's book, Everlasting Man, that for the first time the Christian position seemed to him to be a sensible one. And this shook him, because he'd always regarded Chesterton to be the most sensible person alive, apart from his Christianity. He found that the books and people whom he ought to have liked, because they were atheist, were dull and uninspiring, and only those who held the wrong views were the ones he could get on with. However, he came to realize that what he was longing for was not joy itself, but the source of joy. This source he called the Absolute, and it was Chesterton and others who showed him that his idea of this absolute being was turning into something more and more like the God that the Christians talked about. Reluctantly, Lewis changed from atheist to theist.
The odd thing was that before God closed in on me, I was in fact offered what now appears to be a moment of wholly free choice. In a sense, I was going up Headington Hill on the top of a bus, without words and, I think, almost without images. A fact about myself was somehow presented to me. I became aware that I was holding something at bay or shutting something out, or, if you like, that I was wearing some stiff clothing like corsets or even a suit of armour, as if I were a lobster. I felt myself being given, there and then, a free choice. I could open the door or keep it shut. I could unbuckle the armour or keep it on. The choice appeared to be momentous, but it was also strangely unemotional. I was moved by no desires or fears. In a sense, I was not moved by anything. I chose to open, to unbuckle, to loosen the rein. Then came the repercussion on the imaginative level. I felt as if I were a man of snow at long last beginning to melt. The melting was starting in my back, drip, drip, and presently trickle, trickle. I rather disliked the feeling. Remember, I had always wanted, above all things, not to be interfered with. I had wanted, mad wish, to call my soul my own. I had been far more anxious to avoid suffering than to achieve delight. Doubtless, by definition, God was reason itself, but would he also be reasonable in that other, more comfortable sense? Not the slightest assurance on that score was offered me. Total surrender, the absolute leap in the dark, were demanded. You must picture me alone in that room at Magdalen, night after night, feeling, whenever my mind lifted for a second from my work, the steady, unrelenting approach of him who I had so earnestly desired not to meet. That which I greatly feared had at last come upon me. In the Trinity term of 1929, I gave in and admitted that God was God, and knelt and prayed.
Lewis now forgot all about the things which had pointed to God, because he was now only interested in God himself. He started to attend college chapel and his parish church in order to declare his new allegiance, although he was not yet a Christian. It was not until 2 years later that he came to understand how Christ fitted into the picture. His own account of this transition from theist to Christian does rather leave a lot of unanswered questions. In fact, the full story didn't emerge until after his death, so for a full explanation I turned to Walter Hooper, who was Lewis's private secretary for a while before becoming his biographer, and I asked him how Lewis made this transition from theism to Christianity.
He had heard, like we hear today, unfortunately, too much of the Jesus Christ as a good example type of business. And that did not satisfy him any more than it should satisfy the bishops of the church or any of the Christians in it. And so he lingered in that state of uncertainty. It continued until one particularly important evening, which was the 19th of September 1931. He had invited his friend Professor J.R.R. Tolkien and his friend Hugo Dyson to dine with him in Magdalen. And after dinner, they walked through Addison's Walk until a windstorm drove them inside. And there they sat up till 3 a.m. talking about the problem, what had been holding C.S. Lewis back. Writing to Arthur Greaves about this, he says, "My puzzle was the whole doctrine of redemption, in what sense the life and death of Christ saved or opened salvation to the world. I could see how miraculous salvation might be necessary. One could see from ordinary experience how sin could get a man to such a point that he was bound to reach hell in this life unless something quite beyond mere natural help or effort stepped in. And I could well imagine a whole world being in the same state and similarly in need of miracle. What I couldn't see was how the life and death of someone else, whoever he was, 2,000 years ago could help us here and now, except insofar as his example helped us. And the example business, the one which I think we push still too hard, though true and important, is not Christianity. Right in the center of Christianity, in the Gospels and St. Paul, you keep on getting something quite different and very mysterious, expressed in those phrases I have so often ridiculed: propitiation, sacrifice, the blood of the Lamb, expressions which I could only interpret in senses that seemed to me either silly or shocking. Now, what Dyson and Tolkien showed me was this, that if I met the idea of sacrifice in a pagan story, I didn't mind it at all. Again, that if I met the idea of a God sacrificing himself to himself, I liked it very much and was mysteriously moved by it. Again, that the idea of the dying and reviving God, Balder, Adonis, Bacchus, similarly moved me, provided I met it anywhere except in the Gospels. The reason was that in pagan stories I was prepared to feel the myth as profound and suggestive of meanings beyond my grasp, even though I could not say in cold prose what it meant. Now, the story of Christ is simply a true myth, a myth working on us in the same way as the others, but with this tremendous difference that it really happened. And one must be content to accept it in the same way, remembering that it is God's myth, while the others are men's myths.
Lewis was convinced, and the struggle for him was now almost over. A few days later he went with his brother Warren to Whipsnade Zoo by motorcycle and sidecar. He recalls that when he set out, he did not believe that Jesus Christ was the Son of God. But by the time they arrived at the zoo, he did. That final acceptance of Jesus Christ into his heart he could not explain, for while the conversion in his head was attributable to mental and logical processes, the conversion of his heart was something spiritual, and therefore rather too solid and real to be expressed in something so frail as language. Lewis's experience on the road to Whipsnade wasn't perhaps quite as dramatic as the experience St. Paul had on the road to Damascus, but the result was the same. The switch was from antagonist to protagonist, and Lewis went on to become very much the apostle to the Gentiles. Just 2 years after his conversion, he published his first book as a Christian. The Pilgrim's Regress is an allegorical work inspired by The Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan, whom Lewis admired greatly. In it, he tried to avoid any autobiography, but used the allegorical form to describe some of the problems that people in general encounter on their road to faith. And so began a great stream of Christian apologetics, intended for the layman and published in the popular press. Many of the books published since his death are collections of these articles from various periodicals. The task of collecting and editing these writings has been taken on by Walter Hooper in conjunction with Collins Fount paperbacks, who now regard Lewis's writings as their backbone. Sarah Baird Smith is an editorial director at Collins, and she explained to me why she thought that Lewis's books are so popular.
He came to Christianity quite late, and I think he manages to convey his own delight and excitement at the actual rightness of Christianity, and to bring this across to the reader. And I think that practically everything he has to say makes one think. He is extraordinarily original, and yet his writing is founded in such depth of thought and such wisdom of his own and in such soundness that it has a worth which one just cannot pass by.
The first book that Collins published was Mere Christianity, and this started life as a series of talks which Lewis broadcast for the BBC during the Second World War. Wartime restrictions meant that the talks had to be broadcast live, and so, sadly, they are mostly lost to us. However, on just a few occasions, Lewis couldn't make it to London for the scheduled times, so the BBC pre-recorded these talks. Only one now survives. It's entitled The New Man, and was the last that he gave. The 15-minute recording has remained carefully stored in the BBC sound archives, and here's a short extract.
I was pointing out last time that the Christian life is simply a process of having your natural self changed into a Christ self, and that this process goes on very far inside. One's most private wishes, one's point of view are the things that have to be changed. That's why unbelievers complain that Christianity is a very selfish religion. Isn't it very selfish? Even morbid, they say, to be always bothering about the inside of your own soul, instead of thinking of humanity. Now, what would an NCO say to a soldier who had a dirty rifle, and when told to clean it, replied, "But, Sergeant, isn't it very selfish, even morbid, to be always bothering about the inside of your own rifle, instead of thinking of the United Nations?" Well, we needn't bother about what the NCO would actually say. You see the point? The man's not going to be much use to the United Nations if his rifle isn't fit to shoot with. In the same way, people who are still acting from their old natural selves won't do much real permanent good to other people. It's the old story. What you are comes out in what you do. A crabapple tree can't produce eating apples. As long as the old self is there, its taint will be over all we do. We try to be religious and become Pharisees. We try to be kind and become patronizing. Social service ends in red tape and officialdom. Unselfishness becomes a form of showing off. I don't mean, of course, that we're to stop trying to be good. We've got to do the best we can. If the soldier's fool enough to go into battle with a dirty rifle, he mustn't run away. But I do mean that the real cure lies far deeper. Out of ourselves and into Christ we must go. The change won't, for most of us, happen suddenly. And I must admit that for most Christians, it'll only be beginning to the very end of our present lives. But there are some in whom it goes further, even before death, far enough for you to see it. Their very faces and voices are different. When you meet them, you know you're up against something which, so to speak, begins where you leave off. Something stronger, quieter, happier, more alive than ordinary humanity. You can become one of the new men in Christ if you like. Or, if you prefer, you can refuse the step and sink back. Now, if we take the step, it involves losing what we now call ourselves. When you've completely given up yourself to his personality, you will then, for the first time in your life, be developing into a real person. our real selves are, so to speak, all waiting for us in him. What I call myself now is hardly a person at all. It's mainly a meeting place for various natural forces, desires and fears, etc., some of which come from my ancestors, and some from my education, some perhaps from devils. The self you were really intended to be is something that lives not from nature, but from God. But on the other hand, it's just no good at all going to Christ for the sake of developing a fuller personality. As long as that's what you're bothering about, you haven't begun. Because the very first step towards getting a real self is to forget about the self. Give up yourself and you'll find your real self. Lose your life and you will save it. Submit to death, submit with every fibre of your being, and you'll find eternal life. Look for Christ, and you'll get him, and with him, everything else thrown in. Look for yourself, and you'll get only hatred, loneliness, despair, and ruin.
The Voice of C.S. Lewis from 1944. His association with the BBC was long and happy. He found himself in great demand as a speaker, and obliged whenever he could. He was not without his critics, though. The popular press were not keen on his strong defence of a Christian sexual morality. His insistence on the individual's responsibility for his own actions and conduct led him to attack the philosophies behind communism, or collectivism as he called it, and this laid him open to charges of being a mouthpiece of the state, something he rejected with equal insistence. But, sensitive to this point of view, he reluctantly and graciously declined both a CBE and a knighthood in the early 50s, for fear that these would be regarded by some as reward from the establishment. He was so unwilling to take any personal reward for his writing and broadcasts that he gave all his fees away to charities and needy people. In fact, he did this so eagerly that he forgot that he was still liable for tax, and would have found himself out of pocket if it were not for the help of his old friend Owen Barfield, then in legal practice in London, who set up a fund to manage the distribution of his royalties. The 7 Chronicles of Narnia were written between 1950 and 1953, but published annually from 1950. 1955 was a year that brought great change for Lewis. Cambridge University, in an attempt to lure him away from Oxford, created a chair in medieval and Renaissance literature, and invited Lewis to be the professor. Flattered, he rather reluctantly accepted the position, and moved his allegiance from Magdalen College, Oxford, to Magdalen College, Cambridge, retaining the family home in Oxford, where he returned at weekends. Shortly after this change, he was invited to write an article for the Cambridge Review, comparing the two universities.
The great difficulty in comparing my new university with my old is, of course, that of distinguishing differences between the universities as such from differences between my own life at the one and at the other. My change of allegiance has coincided with a change of status. At Oxford I was a busy college teacher. Here I am chairborne. I fly first, therefore, to what is simple, external, and certainly objective. The first and most obvious thing about Cambridge is a glorious negation. We have no Lord Nuffield here. Modern Oxford has been not unjustly described as the Latin Quarter of Cowley. Cambridge is very much more like the Oxford I first knew. Cambridge is more gorgeous. One wears a white tie more often. The feasts are more splendid. Everyone asks me what I think about religion at the two universities, so I suppose I must now say something of this subject. On the one hand, I think the percentage both of dons and of undergraduates who accept or even practice some kind of Christianity is higher at Cambridge than at Oxford. On the other hand, when unbelief does occur here, it seems to be incomparably more militant, more self-conscious, more organised, more interested, even excited, than at Oxford.
Lewis remained at Cambridge for 8 years until shortly before his death in 1963. He was at heart an Oxford man, and Oxford still retains indelible memories of Lewis. His favourite pub, the Eagle and Child, or Bird and Baby as his circle of friends called it, attracts visitors from all over the world. They come to see where Lewis and Tolkien chatted with other friends, and they thrill to see photographs of Lewis and other members of the Inklings up on the walls. The Bodleian Library contains many manuscripts on public display, and his old university has a C.S. Lewis Society. One of its recent past presidents is Jeremy Dyson, and he became responsible for the title of a C.S. Lewis book, a collection of some essays and newspaper articles dating back as far as 1940. The book is called Present Concerns, and Jeremy Dyson suggested this title to its editor after reading the manuscript.
Well, I thought that many of the concerns which the essays dealt with were very present and still very real today, and he addresses many of the general issues, and he doesn't deal with all the particulars, and the general issues haven't changed very much over the last 40 or 50 years. And so he strikes at the nub and gets right to the heart of the thing. For instance, on living in an atomic age, we may know that the deployment of missiles has changed in various ways, but the heart of the issue hasn't really changed at all. Basically, he's reminding us, first of all, that we're all going to die anyway, and if that is not what we're worried about atomic weapons, many would say they're worried that atomic warfare will bring about the end of civilization, and he then brings it back on us and asks us, well, what is the purpose of civilization? And in fact reminds us that the threat of atomic warfare may in fact be a good thing, because it brings us to think about what is life all about. Is there something more important than civilization just in itself?
Another collection of particularly pithy essays appears in a book called God in the Dock, and one of those essays, written in 1948, deals with the subject of the ordination of women. Lewis was firmly against it. For the reasons, you'll have to read it for yourself. But his view on this issue does give us one small rare clue as to where he might be placed on the Christian denominational spectrum. One of the great strengths of Lewis's writings is that they appeal to Christians right across all denominational boundaries. We know that he attended college chapel during term time, and his own Anglican parish church at weekends. He would also go to confession, and argued very strongly the case for praying for the dead. Yet he was, and is, popular with fundamentalists and evangelicals. So if it were compulsory to wear a denominational tag, what would Lewis's be? Walter Hooper.
His publishers were occasionally asked if they could translate, for instance, one of his books, say, Miracles, into Japanese. I remember that did come up in 1960, but the translators, who were Baptist, wanted to remove all references to alcohol and tobacco. And so Lewis was asked by his publishers if they would be permitted to do that, and he said, absolutely not. He said, the idea behind that is to trot me out as a teetotaler and as a fundamentalist, which I am not. And he says, so far, all the denominations seem to have accepted me, and I think it would be hypocritical for me to be brought out as something which I'm not, a fundamentalist. I would say that Lewis could be best described as, say, Anglo-Catholic, but perhaps more precise than that, a Tractarian. A Tractarian, perhaps like Dr. Pusey, who believed as much of the Catholic faith as is permitted while being an Anglican. But where Lewis, I think, perhaps did the greatest service for many, many people, including me, was that he refused to discuss churchmanship. Anyway, I made the mistake one day of asking Lewis something having to do with high church and low church. He looked at me as though I had offered him poison, and he said, "We never talk about those things."
As well as the move to Cambridge in the mid-50s, another major event took place in Lewis's life. He married at the age of 57. His bride was Joy Davidman Gresham, an American divorcee with whom he'd been exchanging correspondence for some years. The marriage surprised all Lewis's friends, not least because it was a registry office marriage and a marriage of convenience. Joy was a visitor, but wanted to stay in England, for which she needed British citizenship. So Lewis obliged by extending his citizenship to her by marriage. They were close friends, but didn't live together as man and wife until the following year, when Joy discovered that she was dying of cancer. Despite her illness, they had 4 happy years together until Joy died in 1960, leaving him with 2 stepsons, David and Douglas, boys of about the same age as Jack and Warnie when their mother died. Joy's death certainly hurt Lewis, but some people have wrongly assumed that this tragedy caused him to lose his faith in God. In the following year, he wrote a book called A Grief Observed, which dealt with the subject of bereavement, and in it his trust in God shines through. The book was not intended to be autobiographical, so Lewis wrote it under a pseudonym and used a different publisher. Rather ironically, the book was then recommended to him by well-meaning friends. After Lewis himself died, his brother Warren prepared to move out of the Kilns, their Oxford home, and into a smaller house. The Kilns still contained a number of Lewis's manuscripts, which Warren was not too interested in, and which he would have had no room for. It was thanks to the gardener, Fred Paxford, that some of these manuscripts survived. Incidentally, Paxford is supposed to be the character on which that of Puddleglum the Marshwiggle is based. Anyway, Walter Hooper takes up the story.
I felt very strongly one day that I should go out and see Major Lewis, C.S. Lewis's brother. When I went out that day, I met Paxford the gardener coming down the path from the house, and he seemed very happy to see me. He says, "I'm very glad you came." He says, "Major Lewis has been burning the manuscripts of Mr. Jack all for the last 3 days. There's a bonfire which he's had going for 3 days. And he said this morning he gave me a good many papers which I think belong to Mr. Jack. And I said, Walter Hooper would like to have those. And he said, well, put them in a cupboard, and if he comes today, he can have them. But if not, they go on the fire. Anyway, when I was having tea with Major Lewis, he did mention that Paxford had prevented him from burning what turned out to be a great many notebooks, perhaps all of C.S. Lewis's notebooks, and a good many other papers as well. And he made it clear that, as Paxford had said, that unless I carried them away that day, they would go on the bonfire. I had been out to look at the bonfire, and I could see what had been stacks of manuscripts on it, but it was impossible to retrieve anything from that fire. Then came what seemed to be a rather large problem. I didn't think I could walk all the way back to the bus stop, which was a mile away, with so many books. And so I asked Major Lewis if I could take half that day and then come back the next day and get the others. He said, no, whatever you leave will go on the bonfire this evening. So I borrowed 2 huge suitcases and packed everything into those. and I had to literally drag those to the bus stop and onto the bus, and then finally to Keble College. But I'm jolly glad I did. It is from those manuscripts which were saved from the bonfire that many of the works which I published have come.
Thanks to Walter Hooper, new books by C.S. Lewis still appear in the bookshops from time to time, and I asked Sarah Baird Smith at Collins if there are still more to come.
Yes, indeed. We have been publishing a new book by C.S. Lewis every year, steadily, and there is indeed more to come. His letters have hardly begun to be touched. We're actually going to be publishing an edition of one book of his letters very shortly. There's a vast diary which he wrote very early on, which I think probably parts of it could be published, and there is more material, much more material to come, which is very exciting indeed.
Over 3 million of Lewis's Christian books have been sold, and the Narnia books have sold over 5 million copies in just the last 8 years, showing how popular they still are 30 years after they were written. While the Narnia books are children's stories pure and simple, there is an undeniable Christian content to them. Lewis never named Christ in them, but the parallel between Christ and the great lion Aslan is unmistakable. At the end of the book Voyage of the Dawn Treader, 2 children, Edmund and Lucy, find themselves confronted by a lamb during their search for Aslan's country at the edge of the world.
"Please, lamb," said Lucy, "is this the way to Aslan's country?" "Not for you," said the lamb. "For you, the door into Aslan's country is from your own world." "What?" said Edmund. "Is there a way into Aslan's country from our world too?" "There is a way into my country from all the worlds," said the lamb. But as he spoke, his snowy white flushed into tawny gold, and his size changed, and he was Aslan himself, towering above them and scattering light from his mane. "Oh, Aslan," said Lucy, "will you tell us how to get into your country from our world?" "I shall be telling you all the time," said Aslan. "But I will not tell you how long or short the way will be, only that it lies across a river. But do not fear that, for I am the great bridge builder. And now come, I will open the door in the sky and send you to your own land." "Please, Aslan," said Lucy, "before we go, will you tell us when we can come back to Narnia again? Please, and oh, do make it soon." "Dearest," said Aslan very gently, "you and your brother will never come back to Narnia." "Oh, Aslan," said Edmund and Lucy both together in despairing voices. "You are too old, children," said Aslan, "and you must begin to come close to your own world now." "It isn't Narnia, you know," sobbed Lucy. "It's you. We shan't meet you there. And how can we live, never meeting you?" "But you shall meet me, dear one," said Aslan. Are you there too, sir?" said Edmund. "I am," said Aslan, "but there I have another name. You must learn to know me by that name. This was the very reason why you were brought to Narnia, that by knowing me here for a little, you may know me better there."
Lewis's critics accused him of using stories to indoctrinate children with Christianity, but he maintained that it was never his intention to allegorize the Christian faith in this way.
Some people seem to think that I began by asking myself how I could say something about Christianity to children, and then fixed on the fairy tale as an instrument, and then collected information about child psychology, and decided what age group I'd write for, then drew up a list of basic Christian truths, and hammered out allegories to embody them. This is all pure moonshine. I couldn't write in that way at all. Everything began with images. A fawn carrying an umbrella, a queen on a sledge, a magnificent lion. At first, there wasn't even anything Christian about them. That element pushed itself in of its own accord. I put into my books what I would have liked to have read when I was a child, and what I still like reading now that I'm in my 50s. That's always been my reason for writing. People won't write the books I want, so I have to do it for myself.
Lewis received many letters from children and adults about his books. In 1985, Collins published a collection of some of the replies that Lewis gave. Here is one, written to a young admirer named Philip.
Dear Philip, to begin with, may I congratulate you on writing such a remarkably good letter. I certainly could not have written it at your age. And to go on with, thank you for telling me that you like my books, a thing an author is always pleased to hear. It is a funny thing that all children who have written to me see at once who Aslan is, and grown-ups never do. Please tell your father and mother how glad I am to hear that they find my serious books of some value. With all best wishes to you and to them, yours sincerely, C.S. Lewis.
The day after he wrote that letter, C.S. Lewis died in his home in Oxford, just a few days before his 65th birthday. Even now, children still write to him, asking for more Narnia books, and Walter Hooper has to break the sad news that there will be no more, for the author is now himself in Aslan's country.